Hey everybody, today we're going to do a video that people have been asking a lot about, and it's our stitching method. So we do a saddle stitch without using a stitching pony. So I'm going to set up a little sample to show you how we do everything. This is just 2 pieces of veg tan. I'm going to glue these together and then we're going to get going and I'll show you how we go about stitching without a stitching pony. So the first thing you need to do, regardless of the way you're stitching, is we need to make a stitch line. We're going to use a set of calipers, and these are fully adjustable. You can use these knobs, or depending on the type that you have, to spread them apart or close them together and get the exact distance you want. And this distance is going to be from the edge of the leather to where your stitch line is going to be. So basically what you do is you hook one side in and you press down on the other, and this is going to give you a nice straight line that's going to be perpendicular to your edge. If your edge isn't straight, your stitch line isn't going to be straight. But when you're doing a lot of curved stuff, that's good. You know, if you're doing a lot of curved detailing, Western, whatever style you're doing, that's good. If you want a straight line, then you're going to have to cut your leather straight if you're using calipers to mark your stitch line. The next thing we're going to need to do is punch our stitching holes so that we have something to sew through. And when you're using a stitching pony, there are a bunch of different ways you can do this. Some people will use stitching chisels like these from Weaver. We like these a lot. Some people will use these only to mark the leather. They won't go all the way through. And then they'll use an awl like this, once they're in the clamps, to individually punch each hole. We're not going to do that because we're not using a stitching pony. What we're going to do is we're going to use our stitching chisels with a maul, and we're going to go down and we're going to punch completely through the leather, creating holes that we can stitch through. So now comes the sewing part. To do the sewing, we're going to need 2 needles. This is a 2-needle stitch. We're going to use, this is 0.6 millimeter Ritz Tiger thread, pair of scissors, and a lighter, and then the lighter is going to be to back stitch. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to measure our thread, and you can, depending on how thick the leather is that you're using, or the seam that you're sewing, you can use either between 4 and 6 times the length. We're going to go with 4 because this is only two layers. And you're going to clip that off. And then we need to thread our needles. So to thread a needle, you got to go through the eye of the needle like this. But as we're using, this is like kind of a flat woven wax thread. It's not really going to stay. So what I do is I just kind of poke through once here, like this, and pull down, and then you pull, and that locks the needle onto the thread. And you're going to do this on both sides so that you have one needle on either end of the length of thread that you've got. So now is the time to stitch. Now, when I learned this method, it was called the leapfrog stitch, and it's basically a saddle stitch, except instead of having it clamped like this, you're holding it facing you, and you're basically going one side to the other. It looks, when you're just casually watching it, it kind of looks like you're not keeping tension, but we're going to show you, you end up wrapping the thread around fingers and keeping tension and pulling at specific times. It does take a little bit of practice to get used to it, but it's a great way if you're traveling and want to make something, or you just don't own a stitching pony, to get a well-tensioned saddle stitch. We've been doing it for almost 15 years and have never had a stitch line break due to anything but old age, 10 years old, abrasion, that kind of thing. So with this stitch, I work back to front and then front to back. So we're going to start by putting 1 needle in the first hole and 1 needle in the second hole and pulling them both through. And this is where the finger tension comes in. What I do is I take my middle finger and my ring finger and I hold the thread that I'm not using and wrap it around my pointer finger. This keeps the tension on that thread. Then what you're always going to do is you're going to take the back needle, or the back thread, you're going to go through the hole that's being used, then you're going to come around and go through a new hole. And that's the leapfrog part of it. But in reality, when you're pulling tight, just like a saddle stitch, you're going to be pulling this thread with your dominant hand, but you're also going to be keeping tension on this thread. So you're basically tensioning the thread just like you would if you were holding it like this and pulling both at the same time. This is very important. If you were to just let this float, you would be pulling your thread and there would be no tension. But if you wrap this around like this, you keep perfect tension. And so as you can see, as I go down the line, I'm going back to front and front to back. My resting place, for me personally, my home base is always with both threads on the opposite side of the piece than I am. And so when you drop the front thread, you get this kind of hand movement down after a while where you reach with your middle finger, you grab it, sort of weave it in between those two fingers, and that's how I end up keeping tension, and you can kind of see there how it looks. So when I'm pulling this back thread through and I'm pulling, I'm sort of pressing down with this hand at the same time so it's tensioning evenly. So this method also allows you to stack threads. As you can see, we have a nice stack going because we're using a diamond awl. You're automatically holding your front thread down. And so you always want to make sure when you put your needle in from your back thread, you're going above it, and that'll automatically stack the thread top and bottom, just like you were using a stitching pony. So when I grab, I'm pulling down, and I'm placing this needle sort of as far as I can. You get a feel for it. This stays out of the way so that this needle easily slides in above it. You're not piercing any threads or anything like that. And then when I pull tight, you can see how this hand kind of automatically just ratchets down and gets that tension. And so at full speed, it looks like this for me. And so once we have our stitch all the way to the end, the way that we lock it off, we don't tie any knots or anything like that. We're going to backstitch. You can backstitch 2 or 3. The most important thing is you want to try to get your stitches to stack, meaning you don't want, when you do this stitch, you want it to lay next to the stitch that's already there. You don't want it to cross over the stitch that's already there. And the reason being, A, it looks nicer, but B, if you cross over, you're going to have this thread sticking up. And as it's used, it's going to be the first thing that hits when it brushes on things, and this stitch will break. So you want to make sure that you're stacking your stitches so that they're even. And we're going to stitch backwards 3. I'll show you what that looks like. And then we're going to clip it and burn it. So now that we're done, you can see that the stitches, we've sewn backwards 3, and what that's going to do is that's going to lock this stitch in like a machine sewn project. And you can see that our stitches are stacking on this side and they're stacking on this side. So the next step is we're simply going to clip this fairly short. This is even a little too long. I'm going to clip a little bit more off of this. And because this is synthetic thread, we're going to basically melt this down, and that's going to seal that off. And it almost mushrooms out so that it can't slip out and the stitch line won't let go. So I use a lighter. People will use, they have these electric zapper things. You can use that too if you want to. We just use a lighter, and you just kind of go very gently. You don't want to burn the leather. Back and forth. And then once you're pretty melted, you just smush it down and you're good to go. And that's our stitch line. Here's a look at our finished stitch line. It's nice and straight. It's nice tension on either side. And quick disclaimer, there are tons of ways to do all of this. I completely understand that this is not the most popular way. Most people use a stitching pony when they think of a saddle stitch. Most people, or a lot of people, will do, I think it's the French style, where you wrap it around and tie the knot in between each stitch. This is always the way that I've done it. It's the way that I was taught to do it. And we have 13 years of products, thousands and thousands of wallets that have been sewn like this that are still in use today. They work perfect. There really isn't much of a strength. When you're using thread this strong, we've hung 50 pounds of weights off of a single thread of this thread. There isn't much you can do to mess up a saddle stitch like this, besides not having the proper tension so that stitches come loose. It's going to be very, very difficult in most settings that aren't weight bearing to break a stitch like this. So this is a simple way to get started if you don't have a stitching pony, or if you're traveling, or if you just like to hold your pieces instead of using the stitching pony, because I personally am much faster at this than any time I've ever used a stitching pony. So thanks for watching. Hope this was helpful, and we'll see you in the next one.